Nothing. You got all these old parts. Cover, plugs, seals, old reverse idler. So I'm going over all the parts I replaced in that Jeep T176 4-speed, and I realized that it's pretty cheap to build this unit. If you think about that, a rebuild kit probably costs about $185, maybe $165 if you find a bargain. And rebuild kits usually have just gaskets and seals, all the small parts, needle bearings, snap rings, and thrust washers, and synchronizer rings, and some of the small parts you may or may not need. But for the most part, that's it. If you have to change hard parts like the idler and the cover like I did, I'm still into this unit for under $400 in parts. Now, the biggest problem with building these units or taking them apart is the bearings. I mean, the bearings are really tight press fits, so I had to use a special puller to take the bearings off. And I'm probably going to have to heat the bearings back on. So why don't you watch part 2 of this video and see how I get this thing back together. And by the way, please subscribe if you can. So the first thing you want to do is reassemble the synchronizer assemblies. And if you remember on the disassembly video, I talked about that these identification grooves go towards the front on the 3/4 synchronizer slider, and the 3/4 synchronizer slider hub, the wider thrust area faces towards 3rd speed gear. Now, if we also look on these splines, usually we can find one of them that's really shiny where the key was riding against, which is this one over here. So there's 3 keys. Line it up with the groove slot like this. Now, some synchronizer assemblies do have a ground identification mark that shows you the orientation and how they match them. These particular assemblies, I can't see any place that shows that, okay? Same thing for the 1-2 assembly. The thrust surface was towards 1st gear, if you recall. And we're going to have this facing towards the back where the teeth were and the fork. Same thing, we'll go look for a spline that has a really shiny spot into it, like this one here where the key was. And then we're going to put them together in that position. Here we go. Looks good. Now, I want to talk about the synchronizer keys. If you're taking the unit apart, you're going to have a bunch of these keys laying around. One thing very important, the 1-2 synchronizer strut key is longer than the 3/4 synchronizer strut key. 1-2 synchronizer strut key is about 1 inch and 80 thousandths. The 3/4 synchronizer strut key is 950 thousandths. You can see the difference here. Problem is, if people put this key on the 3/4 assembly, what it's going to do is lock the unit up. So this is probably one of the common mistakes that everybody makes putting these units together. There's also different types of synchronizer springs. These are the early springs that are used where they just have this kind of hump in the middle of the spring. That hump fits into the hollow of the key on both sides. So you use the same key, put it this way, and on the other side, that way, okay? On the later key, it just has a tang that fits inside the hollow of the key. And you do the same thing, wrap it one way, and on the opposite side, wrap it the other way. So you have an even pressure all around the keys. Okay, let's put together that 1-2 synchronizer assembly. So what I usually do is I start with one key, put it in, and put the spring underneath it like this. Notice the direction that I'm going in. I'm wrapping it around this way. Put the next key in, like this, and then the 3rd key. Now when I flip it over, you're going to see that this spring now goes to that side. So I do this spring in the same direction, like this, and I'll have even balance. See? Do the same thing on the 3/4. Got that spring going this way. Flip it over. Same thing. Nice even spacing. Feels good. Nice and smooth. Nothing's hanging up. All right, so I'm going to take the gears and fit the synchronizer assemblies to the gears. Now, I use forged bronze synchronizer rings for the T170. These are the rings that I use on all my Toploader and actually TKO builds. They fit pretty good on the gears. Now, if I'm looking at this gear here, I can see it's very shiny. It's got a kind of groove worn into it. You can physically feel the groove. This is because of dirt. Nobody changed the oil in this transmission. The oil got very dirty, and the dirt kind of just works into the groove of the gear. Now, I can place this ring on the gear. It feels really good. I can't turn it. It locks well as I'm looking for the ring to lock on the gear, and it does. But what I like to do is break the glaze a little bit with some 800 grit wet dry sandpaper, and I'll just kind of put it around the cone of the gear and just break that glaze and get a little bit rough so the ring bites better and breaks in. The problem with gears when you have, first of all, this gear is not available that easily, and second, when you have a ring that's going to break into a new gear that has these grooves on it, it's very possible that these grooves of the synchronizer ring are not going to line up with these old grooves, and you're going to have shifting issues. So I just want to, that feels really nice and tight. I put some of that HVL lube on it. I use this lube, this HVL lube, to help keep rings from not sticking. But if the box is going to sit for a while, the lube stays in place and keeps that ring surface lubricated. So it's locking up, feels good, grabs the gear good, yet breaks away clean. Right? I'm going to do that with all these other gears too. Same thing. Just break the glaze a little bit. And I'm using 800 paper. This is your basic preparation for any 4-speed transmission to do this, especially when you're dealing with gears that are old. This particular gear set is from the 80s, okay? So it's a pretty old gear set, but in unbelievable, excellent shape. It's just that the oil was never changed. And you get dirt. So, kind of grabs good. Same thing, put the HVL on here. Go through. You can use gear lube as well. I like using this stuff because it's a little bit more high viscosity. It's used primarily for engine assembly, but it works really good for these as well. So, feels good. Locks up. It breaks away. I'll continue again on first gear. You can see every one of these cones has these ridges in them. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get rid of them all, but the thing is, again, just to break the glaze, sort of like when you used to use a glaze breaker on an engine in the day, and when you're just kind of re-ringing it, you would use a glaze breaker to clean up the home, the cylinder bores, so that you would have something to seat on again. Feels good. A little more. And finally, the main drive section, or input shaft. Again, look at these engagement teeth, how beautiful they are. So it's been a really good running transmission. Surprisingly, never been run low on oil. And the reason why I'm always checking it first is I want to see if the ring is going to grab without the fluid, make sure it does lock up good, which it does. So that's all it is to the simple basic gear train prep. That's it. We're going to assemble this now onto the main shaft. All right, so I got my synchronizer rings on all the gears, first, second, third, and the main drive. I got my synchronizer assemblies all together. Next thing to do is assemble the main shaft. But before I do that, I want to show you the small parts kits. Small parts kits have all the small parts in them: needle bearings, snap rings, and thrust washers. Now you see this small parts kit does not come with the first gear thrust washer. That's why you don't want to get rid of that. And I'm looking over here, and this is what I wanted to show you. The OEM thrust washers now come, they're plastic. They're like a nylon type of thrust washer. This is not some cheap washer. This is actually what Tremec makes now for the transmission. But since, again, I showed you that those thrust washers, the bronze ones, were in excellent condition, we're going to reuse the bronze ones. The bad thing about these nylon washers is they don't impregnate particles very well. So if junk gets inside these washers, they tend to tear apart much faster. But this is not something unusual to see these plastic thrust washers in these newer transmissions. So we're going to put this aside up here. We're going to take the main shaft and we're going to start assembling the 1-2 synchronizer assembly. On the main shaft, we're going to put that assembly with the wider thrust surface facing towards the first gear section like this. And these can be press fit on or they can be tapped down if they're loose enough. Some of the Ford Toploaders, the passenger car ones, are actually fairly loose. So let me just see if we can tap this down into place, catch it. Looks like it's going to drop in pretty easy. And what I'm doing is, by the way, I'm holding this together like this because I don't want to be hitting it and then this whole thing fall off. So I'm actually holding it together while I kind of tap it down. And I'm not putting that much pressure on this. It's going down pretty easy. Now, what I do is I try to fit this snap ring in here. If it doesn't fit, I'm going to have to just push it down a little bit more. It feels like it will go in. Just make sure it's down all the way. It feels like it was seated now. Yeah, that's good. I've mentioned this oftentimes in my videos that snap rings have a direction. You can actually see, maybe very hard to see in this little small snap ring, but there's a direction where this area over here on the inside is a little bit wider than the one on the top. And if you flip them around, it makes it very difficult to get the snap ring out. So the narrow portion of the snap ring opening faces towards the direction you want to remove the snap ring in the future. Now what you can also do is, this synchronizer assembly floats a little bit on top loaders. It's normal. It doesn't really hit tight, but you can back it up against the snap ring if you'd like. So now what I usually like to do is I like to put the first gear on with the synchronizer ring just to see how everything is fitting. That's all I'm trying to do. I just want to just mock it up a little bit, make sure it's fitting okay. And this is going to fit like this. Thrust washer will go against it like this. We'll have a little end play, which is what we want. That's going to feel really good. Okay, so I have these actually old 23 spline yokes that I use for these main shafts. Makes a good holder for it. I put it in the yoke. Supports it pretty good. And I simply start assembling the gear train in reverse. And what we're going to do is put the synchronizer ring in for second gear. You want to make sure that it's engaging those keys, these 3 keys. You want to make sure it's engaging those. Put a little assembly lube in the gear. Drop it in place. Put the tank thrust washer in. The tank thrust washer, you're going to find a little hole in the main shaft. You're going to catch the tang in the hole and drop the washer down. Make sure it's seated good. You're going to put the new snap ring in place. perfect. Do the same thing with third gear. Get some assembly lube in it. Drop it down. Putting more assembly lube on the synchronizer ring. Laying that down. Now we're going to have to catch these keys in this ring's slots. Make sure you don't pop them off. Same thing, we can just tap this synchronizer assembly down. Looks like it's going to go down pretty easy. See that? Now as I'm doing that, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of going to make sure I catch the keys as the assembly drops down. So now the keys are caught. Push it down like that. There are selective snap rings in some of these kits, and you don't want to put too thick of a snap ring in there. You want to make sure that you have end play. Everything floats, okay, like this. You can see everything is moving. So if you put too tight of a snap ring, the gear is going to be pushed against the flange and burn up. Having a little bit extra play allows the oil to get on both sides of the thrust surface of the gear. The thrust surface on the main shaft in the gear and the thrust surface inside the hub in the gear. These snap rings go on really tight. Be careful you're wearing goggles because they can pop off and hit you right in the face. Got a little end play, which is what I like. Nice. Now, this gear train is pretty much together. We can put it this way if we'd like. Put the first gear on. These bearings, if you recall, came off really hard, so we're probably going to have to heat them into place. Same thing, I'm dropping the synchronizer ring down onto the keys. Little assembly lube in the first speed gear. Dropping that in place. If you get a regular top loader rebuild kit for this, the thrust washer is the wrong size. You can see it's got a bigger opening on the 176 type of washer. Same concept, but on a Ford Toploader you're going to be using a little smaller washer. So don't throw away these washers. The 176 type washer is not included in small parts kits. So you got to reuse it. Now we got the first gear on the shaft. We've got play too. I'm looking for some little end play there, which is we want. It's nice and smooth, spins good. So the next step is to put all the needle bearings inside the counter gear, inside the reverse idler, and inside the main drive section before we do the final assembly. And there's three different types of needle bearings. It's cluster needle bearings, reverse idle needle bearings, which are smaller, and the main drive needle bearings. So to load the needles, I use the Dynatex's transmission assembly lube. It's not really a grease. It's a kind of lubricant that maintains its tack, because sometimes when you use wheel bearing grease, even the heavy duty wheel bearing grease, it will simply get liquefied, especially here on the Florida heat. All right, so what I do is I take some of this assembly lube and just put it inside the gear like this. Now, you may not want to use your fingers, you may want to wear some gloves, but I simply just take a bunch of them at a time. I don't even load them one at a time. I just take a bunch like this, and I just stick them on my finger like this. Sometimes I recommend that you do it over a pan, so you don't drop the needle bearings on the floor, because you can see that these will get loose and come out. Now, you don't even have to count the needles. This is another thing. All you have to do is put as many needles as you can in there, because it's not, if you can fit another needle, you can fit another needle. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it. So you can see what I did was I've got all the needles loaded, and then you put the little end washer in place. Do the same thing with the other side. Now a lot of times on these kits too, you might get an extra needle or two in them, which is normal. So you can see again, they're all in. Same thing on this side, they're all in. Going to put the other end washer in place, and the gear's ready to go. Now what I also do is I'll take the idler shaft and just push it through the gear. Make sure it spins nice and easy. But what I'm also doing is getting rid of some of the excess grease and actually helping, that helps pack the needles better. You can test it, you can see how it feels. Feels good. It's not going to go anywhere. Now when we install this gear, we're going to install it face down so the needles won't fall out. Let's put it aside. Alright, so see, I got the same thing going on in the cluster gear, front and back. Another trick that you can do is if you're not sure about the needles, as far as the quantity in them, simply take like a screwdriver and see if you can squeeze more space into it. So you can go like this and you can get another needle, then fine. But here I can't, it's nice and tight. So I know that it's loaded correctly. I don't, again, have to count needles. Just go like this. So this is ready to go. Put the two end washers in place. Same thing. Put that aside. Now we're going to, before we put it aside, we'll slide the shaft through it. Make sure it fits good. Get a nice perfect pack. Input shaft. So sometimes in the last needle you kind of have to slide it in like this. It usually won't go in from the top. Like that. Good to go. Right, in the beginning of the video I showed you this reverse idler that was really chipped up badly over here. You can see the teeth are kind of messed up. So I'm going to install a new idler. Slide it in place. Leave it like this on the gear before I do the installation. So what I do is I lay the case face down like this. Just put a little bit of assembly lube on the front washer to make it stick in place. Catch the tang in the groove. Install the gear with the idler in place. Make sure all my spacers and needles are in place. It's a lot easier to just drop it in like this. Install the rear washer. Then all I do is I take the reverse idler shaft and just drop it in place and catch it. Make sure my pieces are aligned. Make sure all the washers are there. Good to go. So the first thing to do to start assembling this is put in the front thrust washer. Use a lot of lube to hold it in place. Put it in the front of the case like this. Catch the tang in the slot in the case. Now what I do is I'm going to drop the cluster in this way, up and down, and slide it in over that washer. Keep in mind where the tang is on this washer. It's going to go right about there. The reason why I do it this way is because it takes a load off the washer, and it makes it really easy to slide these washers into place without struggling. If the cluster is this way, you're going to have to fight the weight of the cluster. Let it drop itself down. The washers really can't drop down because they're caught in the tangs of the case. Now, next step is to take this whole gear train and put it in. And usually, like we did, I put my thumb here, kind of hold the gear from coming out. Get the whole gear train in like this. Just lay it in there. So what I've done here is I put some assembly lube into the 3 key slots of the synchronizer ring. And I'm going to just drop this in like this and then engage the ring into the keys. You'll see it'll drop in. Then we've got our needles again in here. We have a little clearance cut out right over here. I don't know if you could see that. Little flat spot that faces down towards the gear. And we're going to push this right in from the front. And engage the whole gear train. All right, so now I got this whole shaft kind of floating in here. I want to install the counter shaft. So I'm going to carefully flip this over. Get the weight off the counter gear. And the counter gear is going to drop down a bit. Now what I can do here is using a pry bar, go in from one side and lift the counter gear up. I do this all the time. I'll put it in here. I can lift the counter gear up. So I do is I feel for the alignment, feel it's good. Slide it through. Now I've got my finger holding the front. Everything looks really good. Now before I drive this pin in all the way, what I'm going to do is just put some sealant in the inside of the case in the front. This anaerobic gel. This helps prevent any leaks in the future. Because this is an aluminum case, I'm putting some sealant in over here. So once I got that counter shaft front bore sealed, I'll flip this back over. So the reason why I did this is because it helps me support the main shaft for better alignment when I reinstall the bearings. Perfect. So you really shouldn't be heating bearings up with a propane torch. And most people don't have induction heaters. So I'm kind of doing the same thing an induction heater would do. I kind of put a shaft here and I'm supporting the inner race of the bearing with the shaft. I'm going to concentrate the heat on the inner ring of the bearing and at the outer ring. I have a digital thermometer here. I want to get this thing to about 200 degrees because I know that this is going to be a pretty tight press fit. So I'm going to just focus on the inner ring and watch my temperature. Not quite there. And the reason why I'm staying from heating away the whole bearing is because this has got to go into the case. See, a lot of times bearings are held differently in place from the outer ring or the inner ring, and I want this to kind of slip in the case on the outside, but I want it to open up on the inside. If I heat it up on the outside, it's going to expand and it's going to be difficult to get into the case. In the past I've done these and I found I have to get about to 200 degrees, and usually what's going to happen is I'm going to have to work very fast getting this in the case and tap it in with a hammer. And it should go in pretty easy with a hammer because the race is going to be expanded. This is a pretty meaty bearing, and it's really hard to get this thing where it needs to be. Probably close to where we need it now. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll take some WD-40 just to cool it rapidly so it doesn't move around. One down. That'll kind of stabilize things better, keep this centered better, so now we could do the front one. And one thing I noticed is that these small parts kits did not come with the correct size outer bearing snap rings, so we're going to have to reuse them. Sometimes the standard bearings and kits and rebuild kits, and on the bearings that are standard snap ring bearings, this particular width of the snap ring can vary. Sometimes they're special for transmissions. For example, this is a standard 308 snap ring, and you could see that the width here is bigger than this snap ring. So possibly if you put the stock snap ring with the bearing, that came with the bearing on the transmission, the extension housing might not fit correctly. So always try to check this. This is very important, that these snap ring, the width of them is the same as the ones you're replacing. If not, try to reuse the old ones. Hopefully you didn't mangle them. That spins beautiful. Feels really good. Okay, so a few things I want you to notice about installing seals in these particular transmissions is that the edge of the seal goes below the land. So if you're using a tool, you don't want it to have it go flush with this area over here. You need to have it go recessed down. That's to clear the snap ring that's on the input shaft. It's very important. On the rear seal, it's the same thing. If you look at the rear seal, it's recessed below this area over here. So you want to walk the seal down gently if you don't have a driver that fit the perfect diameter of it. So you don't want it to be flush with this. You want it to be right at this level over here, right at that edge. It's very important. You could just take a punch the seal out. I'll clean up the inside a bit. You can see it has an edge that it goes against over here. Even though these have a sort of thick paint coating on the outside to prevent leaks coming from around the seal, I always put some anaerobic gel just as a precaution. Now you see you got to get a little bit below that area. What I'm going to do is take another driver and just catch the edges and bring them down very gradually. You better be careful you don't bend the seal doing this. I don't have a piece that fits correctly. Now you of course want to put some lube on the seal. Always grease your seals. Another thing that I've done too is I've went over this with a file, make sure the surface is nice and smooth and there's no high spots anymore. You can see the little shiny areas that were a little bit high. So I took a file to this and I cleaned this all up so it's nice and flush. And we've got both front and rear seals installed. I'll put some assembly lube on this seal as well, pack it very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this anaerobic gel, use it as an adhesive and an additional sealant, especially around these holes over here because they're wide open. I've also chased these threads here to make sure that they weren't messed up in any way. You want to check these threads before you start assembling it in case you have to repair the threads because a lot of these threads can be messed up. This was a little damaged and I ran a tap through it and kind of cleaned it up. So you just want to go around the perimeter of this, and if you'd like, put a little sealant, a dab here and here just to hold the gasket in place. Now I'll follow the perimeter again on the outside as well. Again. Right, so you want to catch all the bolts first before you tighten everything down. I put some nice flat washers on this. The hardware really wasn't that good that was on this transmission, so I put some new hardware on it. These are 9/16 headed bolts. And some bolts take nuts and bolts. Actually nuts on the back side. So I've got a flat washer on this side, lock washer on that side. I'm torquing these bolts down to 25 foot-pounds. Try to always be neat and wipe the sealant down. So again, I'm using this gasket maker from Dynatex, the 494-77 anaerobic gel. Put it on both sides of the gasket like I did on the transfer case gasket. The oil notch of the bearing retainer faces towards the bottom. Seal is greased. I've also got sealant on the bolts because these holes are not blind. They go right through to the case, so oil can leak out of these bolts unless you put sealant on them. It's very important. Don't forget that. You can get little drips and oozing from the bolt threads. So this dab of sealant on all these threads of the bolts. All right, these bolts are going to get torqued down to 15 to 18 foot-pounds. What's good about these digital wrenches is I can look at it as it gradually brings the bolts down. So I can bring it to, like, say 8, and then 12, and 15, and so forth. All right, let's go put this top cover on now. Now before we put the top cover on, the top cover is in neutral position, and I want you to notice how the 1-2 fork is pretty much in alignment with the reverse fork. See that? So you have to make sure that the reverse idler gear below, the slot that the fork fits into, is in line with the slot of the 1-2 slider. This way everything will drop down nice and easy. You don't want to force it down, you could break the cover. Everything should just kind of drop down and seat perfectly in place. Now a lot of times you're going to have to bring this in first, kind of get it over the 1-2 slider, then into the 3-4 slider, and then drop it down. So what I've done is I've installed all the bolts and the dowel bolts in position. I put some nice washers under the dowel bolts, got it all together, got all the bolts loose first so the cover's seated. Then I'm going to go run the bolts down with the gun. And first I do the dowel bolts. Now I'm going to torque these bolts down to 15 to 18 foot-pounds. I'll do the dowel bolts first. Get them locked down. And I'll go from the middle and out. Wipe off the excess sealant. Okay, so we got everything together. Everything looks good. We got a few little minor things I got to put in here. I got to put in the reverse light switch, the shifter, and the fill and drain plugs. I'm going to be replacing the fill and drain plugs with magnetic plugs, some new plugs too, just to help keep some of the dirt out of the oil. It looks pretty good. So these kits for the stick come with the whole mechanism. A new boot, a new retainer cup, spring, and a new ball socket. So why is this important to change? Because this is a ball socket and the spring rides in here, it's always kind of forced to center the stick. So if the spring gets weak, if this gets worn or something happens, the stick may not center properly and flop around. So this little mechanism and the way it's designed to work will keep the stick centered better. Now if we look at this particular piece here, we can see how it's shaped. And in the beginning of the video, this is a new piece. We looked at this old one here, and you can see that it's kind of stretching out a little bit. You see it's worn and stretched down. And so when they start to bend down like this and get loose, then you start getting a sloppy stick and a wobbly stick as well. So by changing this simple kit, it's very easy to change. Take the old boot off, the old retainer, old cup, the old spring. First thing I do is I have the socket greased. I place the stick on it like this. I will place the spring on it. What I will also do is put the cup on and make sure the tang of the spring, in other words, this tang of the spring here, is in that kind of little cutout of the cup. That keeps the spring from rotating and gives you a little bit better pressure. I'll coat this with grease too. Just like this. I'll place the cup in place. It's going to be at a little bit of an angle first. Now these are going to be really tough to get on, so I'm going to do my best here. There we go. Nice. So the boot has these little cutouts for these little pivots over here, and you just kind of drop it in. There's actually an alignment hole over here to show you where it goes. These are really tough to get on sometimes, but this isn't too bad. But that's how it goes on. It doesn't really go on round looking. It'll kind of conform to its shape later on. That's it. So I put some Teflon tape on the threads of that reverse light switch and reinstalled it into the top cover. And pretty much that completes the buildup of this transmission. This Jeep T176 4-speed, it should really work out very nice. I mean, there was very little wear on the gears. It should end up being a really nice, smooth shifting transmission. I can't wait to get the feedback from the customer when this is installed. Now, I'm also doing a rebuild for the Dana 300 transfer case that's going to go behind this. So please subscribe to my channel, turn on your notifications so you'll be informed of upcoming videos coming up. And you know, sometimes the notifications really don't work from YouTube. So check into the channel once in a while and review all the videos. It would really mean a lot to me if you also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. So thanks for watching. You can also follow me on the Motor Crush app. I'll have my show schedule there. I'll be at the SEMA 2018 show and the Performance Racing Industry show in Indianapolis come December. So again, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it very much. See you soon.